So, lots to talk about today because I'm slightly behind, but I have every hope and belief that I will catch up. So, this week's reading we have the Etruscan discipline, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. So, you have your postings and your regular quiz due on Sunday. The research essay, which we talked about last week, is due on the 12th, right before our final class. And then, because this is a hybrid exam, a hybrid class, we're technically a Tuesday-Thursday class. Only the Thursday is digital, but our exam will be in class, in this room, in person, on the Thursday after our final class. So that will be, and for some reason it's 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So if you have a conflict, the exam schedule is supposed to be set up so that there are no conflicts, but I'm already aware of at least one. And that's simply because, hey, there's a million classes at Lehman College, and each of them has their own special place in the schedule. So if you have a conflict, what we can do is we can take your exam, show me the conflict, and if you can't resolve it with your other professor, you can potentially take the exam during one of my other exam periods. If that is the case for you, please come and talk to me about it. The review sheet will be posted as soon as I've completed it, which hopefully will be this week, and we'll talk more about the final exam at our next class meeting. But the basic idea is that we will have an in-class written exam that is the usual with blue books and so forth, and it will have 2 sections, as is normally the case on my 300 level exams. One is a examination of terms, identification and impact, in which I provide you with a set of terms or names that are relevant to the semester. And you give me a brief definition and then talk about why it's significant. So a term might be, just for example, evolutionary monotheism, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And you would talk about what that is and why it's significant, what that tells us about the religion in the ancient world. Or it might be a set of names. Is somebody moaning? Okay. I can only imagine what it'll be like on the actual day. Very lamentations, very appropriate for a final exam in each instrument. Or it might be names like Zarathustra, and you would talk about who Zarathustra is, but more importantly, why he's significant, what role he plays. And so that would be the identification and impact part. I would give you I would ask you to write about 4 or 5 of them, and I'd give you 12 or 15 to choose from. All of the names and terms that I use for that identification and impact will be on the review sheet. So once you have the review sheet, you'll be able to start reviewing the terms as a means of prioritizing what you need to look for in your notes. The other part of the exam is essays, and so I'll ask you to write maybe 2 essays in the blue book. These would be 3 pages where you make an assertion and support it with examples and evidence from our classes, from the readings that we've done, from the primary sources, from the things that you've discovered in your research. And these would be about themes that are relevant to the entire course. And so you would be talking about the role of ritual, or the nature of mythology, or the way in which collective sense of religion is made local, or the other way around. Divination, things that have recurred in many or all of our discussions, and how they relate to each other. And we'll have a better handle on that once I've managed to finish putting together a review sheet and have a clearer sense of what I...
How many pages did you say?
So it'll be like, each essay will be like, 3 pages in the blue book. So you'll be writing, you'll basically be writing like, 4 or 5 paragraphs for each essay. Trying to make an argument and supporting it with 3 examples from everything that we've done. So we'll talk more about this next week. I just want to get you thinking about what you need to prepare. Remember that there are, in addition to the reading materials, you have your notes from classes, you have the primary sources, you have the discussions from the primary sources, and I will be posting the responses write-ups so that you can look at those as summaries of each of the discussions that we've had on our primary sources. A reminder, if you haven't turned in your responses write-ups from the ones that you've signed up for, please make sure that you've done that so that we can get that taken care of, and I can share that. I'll hold off on any questions about the final exam for next week. Does anybody have any questions about the research essay? Okay, please make sure to come to me in office hours or by email and talk to me about it. I'm more than happy to discuss with you what you want to write for your research essay, how you want to approach making your argument, what examples you want to give, additional research, anything like that. It's due very soon, so there's an email with a list of reminders and notes that was sent out, and it's also posted on the answer page. And of course, you want to make sure that you've read through the assignment itself very carefully for what it is that I'm looking for, and make sure that you look at the requirements for all papers and make sure that you've satisfied those, because when it says requirements for all papers, it actually is, it applies to all the papers, including this one. So make sure that you've satisfied those before you upload. Any other questions or concerns, issues, problems, allergies, where do babies come from? Yeah. All right, let's finish talking about the Greeks very quickly. We were in the middle of talking about the civic religion of the Greeks when I ran out of time. And, one of the main things that I wanted to sort of emphasize is that the nature of Greek religion is local, in the sense that a lot of the things that are what Homer has done for the Greeks and for us is standardized and connected the gods of the Greeks and made a consistent system out of the way that all of the Greeks look at the gods differently. And so we have a layer of distortion between us and the Greeks. One part of that layer is Homer, and the way that Homer provides that generic view. And the other is that most of our information comes from Athens. And Athens is A, only one city, and B, dramatically atypical. It's atypical. You can tell that it's atypical just because we have all this evidence from it. We have mountains of literature and relics and other information from Athens that we don't have from Thebes and Corinth and everywhere else. And this is because Athens is obsessed with creative production as a means of creating new knowledge and new perspectives. And that includes new knowledge and new perspectives on how they deal with the nature of their culture and how it relates to the gods. And Athens is thrown into a crisis where it goes to war with the least literary culture ever, the Spartans, who never wrote down anything, who believed that creative production was a betrayal and defiance of their culture, because the Spartans spent all of their time devoted to the art of war rather than the art of creative expression. And so this produced an existential crisis for Athens in particular, which only amplified their literary output as they tried to understand who they were and the nature of justice and whether they could rely upon the gods. A lot of the literature that we get from Athens during the period of the Peloponnesian War is about the nature of justice and whether the gods can be trusted to provide it and how this is increasingly a human burden and so forth. The other thing to emphasize is that the civic religion of the Greeks is communal. It belongs to the people. The Greeks have no priestly class. This is the most anomalous thing about the Greeks that they all share. All the other societies in the ancient world have a body of people, a hierarchy of families whose job it is to interpret the gods and to maintain a religious tradition. We think of Greece and Rome in the same breath a lot of the time because together they create the foundation for Western culture. But, in this respect, the Greeks and the Romans could not be more unlike. As we'll see next week, the Roman priestly class is so powerful that they dominate the political structure of Rome. And there has to be a social revolution in order to give the families that don't control the priesthoods any political power at all. More about that next week. But for the Greeks, there is no priestly class. What priests they have are part-time and unofficial and mainly administrative, with certain exceptions, such as at the Oracle at Delphi. Yes.
What would you call an oracle then?
Right. So there are a few exceptions. One of which is the Oracle at Delphi is itself very rare and a holdover from the Bronze Age. The Oracle at Delphi represents essentially a vestige of the Mycenaean religion. The functioning of Greek religion is in terms of communal festivals and shared celebrations, and the structure of it, the framework, the understanding of the gods, comes from literature, comes from Homer and Hesiod, as things that live in the popular consciousness. As a result, the gods of the Greeks function entirely in relation to human needs, either as models of what immorality looks like, because the gods are not bound by human constraints, such as morality and death. And so Zeus does everything that he wants, and the stories of Zeus or Apollo coming down to earth in the guise of a swan or a bull and raping people and flitting off, swanning away, leaving damaged women and men behind is about the nature of immorality and a counterexample to what it means to be human. But the Greek gods have a second function, which is to protect the nature of human community. In literature, their role is to ensure that humans place the community ahead of self. And so they are offended in literature by anybody who acts in a selfish way, because selfishness, ambition, hubris, greed, and so forth is destructive to the community. And so we see the gods acting in a way that punishes those who act in a selfish way, not simply by punishing the wrongdoer, but by showing that this is destructive to those that the wrongdoer cares about. The Greek gods always punish families and descendants, because what they're punishing is something that's destructive to those very people. In other words, those punishments are the result of the mortal's actions. This is the way that Greek literature is framed. The gods are there as reinforcements of human morality, because their role in society belongs to the people. It's not about the empowerment of a particular group of priests who would use it for the enshrinement of the elite and for the values and necessities of the few. Greek religion emphasizes the values and needs of the many. The nature of the Greek history means that all of this gets passed. Oh, sorry.
I had a question about the priests again, or the lack of priests. If there was some sort of community, did they do community religious rituals? And if they did, like, who would lead them if there were no priests? And who would make sure the ritual is done in a right way or whatever?
Right. So that's a good question. And the answer is that part of that is governed by tradition and by written records when they're available. But part of the reason for oral history during the Greek Dark Age, and this persists after the Greeks reacquire writing, is so that the reasons and methodology of festivals would be maintained from one generation to the next. So for the most part, the nature of a festival is something that everybody would already know. The community would have, the magistrates of the community would have a responsibility for ensuring that festivals go properly according to records and tradition. And in some cases you would have, as I mentioned, a sort of part-time priest whose job is mainly that sort of administrative role.
Is it like almost like how Mormons, every male is a priest kind of thing?
Sort of, but there's still a hierarchy for the Mormons. So, it's more decentralized than that. Okay. You're right in that it sort of empowers the collective community, but the Mormon community still has a centralized authority. In Greece, the authority lays with the people themselves, at least tacitly. So, one of the results of all this is that the nature of Greek religion spreads across the Greek community as they expand and colonize outside of the Aegean, and this sort of emphasizes both the pan-Hellenic nature of Greek religion, all the things that the Greeks share, and the localness. Greek colonies are children of a particular Greek city-state. So instead of, if we're founding a colony, say Posidonia, which is here in Libya, if we found a colony called Posidonia, it's not a whole bunch of people from all over Greece. It's going to be founded by a particular Greek city-state, Corinth. And it's going to be made up of Corinthian citizens who are an extension of Corinthian practices in trade, politics, and religion. And so this sort of local aspect is distributed. And then what happens when you found a colony? When you found a colony, there are people that are already there who have their own traditions. And there's sometimes it's opportune in order to assimilate the people that you are living amongst to imbibe local traditions and make it a part of. So the colonies contribute both to the dispersion of generalized Greek ideas and to the diversity of Hellenic religion. One of the ways in which this manifests is the epithet. So we've encountered this a little bit before. What is an epithet? We talked about this a little bit once when we were looking at the Egyptians, I think, yeah.
Isn't it something written that describes the gods, their functions, or something like that?
In a way, yeah. Anybody want to add to that? If we're talking about an epithet, we are talking about. Go ahead.
It's like a cont'd community that emphasize on like a single deity that they believe in.
Well, it's emphasizing a single deity. It's emphasizing an aspect of a single deity. So where you're on the right track, but the idea is this word aspect is sometimes it's helpful to some people and not to others. It comes from a word that means face. And what it describes is different aspects of the same God. We talked about this a lot. When this came up before, I mentioned that it's not dissimilar to the way that the Christian God is three gods, but also one God. In this case, the Greeks have many different epithets, many different aspects to especially its core gods, which is to say, the gods that all the Greeks tend to place at the center of their local pantheons. And this allows for local traditions that are associated with these common gods. So you might have a local tradition that says that the God that protects your stores in your pantry or in the storeroom of your shop, that is clothed in wool as a metaphor for the protection of all of these stores. You might have a local tradition that particular God is Zeus. And to distinguish that function of Zeus, you talk about him as Zeus Ktesios. And so forth. A lot of these traditions are local and then get picked up as tales spread and get incorporated into larger stories like the Iliad. But as I mentioned, Homer tends to strip these localizations away, and they become stories, many stories associated simply with a god named Zeus. Others remain only local. So, for example, in the Great Retra, which is the constitution, the constitution of the city of Sparta, it mentions that the organization of Sparta is due to the actions of Zeus Salanius. And Zeus Salanius doesn't come up in any other context, in any other community. Zeus Salanius is specific just to Sparta. Epithets are a demonstration of how Greek religion is actually distinctively local, and our perception of it as homogenized is due to the distortion of relying upon Homer. Make no mistake, Homer is at the root of Greek society. Everybody shares Homer, but the local religion that people experience is Homer plus local traditions that localize and specify. And so we have the distorting influence of Homer and the distorting influence of relying upon Athens that prevents us from seeing the truly local nature of Greek religion.
So would an example of an epitaph also be like, you know how like some people call like Jesus like, oh, Christ the Redeemer? Is that an epitaph, or is that not the same as what you're describing?
To have an epithet, you'd have to talk about Jesus as being a redeemer under other circumstances and having a different face, performing different kinds of actions on other circumstances. So I think it's more a description of the core concept of Jesus in that particular case. It's one of the things that Jesus does, but you can make an argument either way. It's not dissimilar. I think it's related, but I think Jesus for Jesus to have different aspects, that function is normally performed by talking about the other aspects of the Trinity, God the Father and the Holy Spirit. Those are more like epithets because those are the same God performing in an entirely separate functionality, an entirely separate face. But it is related, I agree. So colonization helps to spread all these things. Indigenous. Okay, so the way in which the Greeks understand the gods is in terms of charis and time. Not a lot of ancient language jargon in this class, but I think it's worth emphasizing this just because certain words nicely embody the concepts that are distinctive to a community. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about charis as the way in which the Greeks understand the gods? Remember this from the text. I think it was on the quiz too. If we think about charis and time, two very interesting Greek words. Nobody remembers. We've already forgotten everything from last week. Let's look at it this way. According to what we understood from last week, how do the Greeks normally understand their relationship with the gods? In terms of everyday life and ritual. Charis is what this is governed by. The way that the Greeks relate to the gods is in terms of this idea of charis, the idea of a favor that is expected to be repaid. That sounds excessively mercantile, and it's more nuanced than that. What it essentially says is it's on a positive footing. What it essentially says is that the Greeks rejoice in giving to the gods, and the gods rejoice in receiving those gifts. So, as a result, there's a very positive feeling of relationship. There's a very strong sense of bonhomie between the Greeks and the gods on an ordinary daily basis. The expectation is that this is a mutually beneficial relationship in which the people pray for the fertility of their crops and for health and the safety of their community and family, and the and repay the answering of those prayers with dance and festival and hymns and dedications and sacrifices, the giving of sanctuaries and so forth. Things that make the gods feel good and joyful. Time is related to this. This is a sense that the gods are honored because they are honorable, because they use their power well. This is how the Greeks developed the understanding of, those in higher positions, that this is something to be earned through good works. When they reject the elitism of the Bronze Age and create this new Greek culture, the root of that is a shared responsibility for the community, and a sense that status and honor comes through achievement, comes through merit. And the gods are understood in the same way, that they are meritorious and use their power in a positive way. This is one of the reasons why the Olympian gods are contrasted with the Titans and other more destructive, instinctive gods of raw natural potency. The Olympic gods bring order and ensure human success. Zeus's first children are the Muses, who inspire the evolution, the progress of the human community. And so the tendency is for the Greeks to value honoring the gods and expecting a positive relationship and taking pleasure in adorning, in sort of this a hobby, a cultural tradition that involves simply making the gods beautiful, because even the gods need a spa day. But this is adornment means things like great temples and great statues, which also celebrates the community that builds them and provide a focal point for identity. So this is not simply about the relationship with the gods. Religion never is. So why is this so different from what we see in tragedy? In tragedy and epic poetry, the gods are wrathful and respond with punishment and the distribution of suffering. The cultural output of the Greeks seems to be in dissonance with this. Any ideas as to why that would be? Why we see here?
Could it be because they abandoned worship of certain gods?
Because they abandoned worship of certain gods. Do you want to clarify that a little bit? Are you thinking like the Bacchae, where Dionysus is mad because a certain community has stopped worshiping him? This is part of it. The Greeks, as I said, enter a period of existential crisis about the nature of justice, and they start looking to themselves as arbiters of what is right and wrong. And this leads to a lot of dramatic output that reinforces traditional values in the worship of the trust of the gods, needing not to be abandoned. So there's sort of a countercultural dynamic going on that produces more and more literature like this. But even beyond that, it's more general. The nature of drama is to highlight a crisis. And In tragedy and in epic poetry, the crisis tends to be about a failure, a destructive act. And it is these destructive acts that the gods are called upon in literature to respond. These are destructive acts that are out of their proportion. Achilles causing the death of Patroklas, for example, is not simply a minor event, but something that's the turning point for the entire Trojan War. The way that Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia in order to receive a little bit of wind when his ships are becalmed is a huge turning point for the story of Agamemnon, because it turns the gods against him, it turns his wife against him, and leads to literally generations of suffering. So the nature of what we see in drama is in deliberate exaggeration of what's experienced in everyday life. In everyday life, the nature of stories is reassuring. The nature of ritual is to resolve any momentary pollutions or impieties through a system of purification that restores smooth sailing and the normal expectation of charis and time. And as I mentioned last week, all this is severed by death. The Greeks expect that the afterlife is a place of nothingness or of a negative experience. Self-awareness without the ability to act, which would be intolerable for a lot of cultures, including the Greeks. And so this means that in ordinary life, the assumption is that rewards and punishments are handled during that time and not held over for after you're dead. The Greeks don't place any real emphasis on after-death judgment. Everything that happens to you in your life is resolved by contemporary response during the time that it happens. And this is part of the appeal of mystery cults and later Christianity in the Greek world, because they offer the prospect of an enhanced afterlife. So now we get back to the reading for last week. So what do we conclude from the story of the death of Patroklas? What did you guys think was most interesting that you were discussing? I saw a lot of interesting comments. So, what did you guys get out of the story of the death of Patroklas? What struck you as most telling about it? Yeah.
The limitations and the powerlessness that both gods and humans had towards fate. Like Zeus, he really couldn't. I mean, he could have done something about Sarpedon, but with Hera explaining the bigger picture, he knew, okay, well, Sarpedon has a son, and I don't want his son to suffer from the wrath of other gods.
Right. So the powerlessness, it's very interesting because the nature of this fate is interesting to try to get your hand on, because the story of Patroklas, it's very clear that Patroklas dies. Patroklas, puts on Achilles' armor and is mistaken for Achilles in the battle and is killed in Achilles' place. it's very clear that that happens because of a choice made by Achilles. And later on, Achilles chooses to brutalize Hector's body in retaliation, and is killed by the arrow that pieces one vulnerable part of his body. So, how does Achilles making these choices square with the idea of fate? Because the Greeks have this very secure mythology about the three sisters and the strings of fate. The way that they share an eyeball in the cartoon is an invention of Disney, but it's metaphorical, and that they're all looking at the same fate. So how does Achilles making these choices square with the idea of fate? Because it does seem to constrain. It seems to constrain the gods and their ability to act in relation to fate. I'm asking you a question that has puzzled philosophers for thousands of years. So, expecting you to come up with something in 5 seconds might be a little unfair. But does anybody have any thoughts about what that means? How that might work? Well, I'll come back around to that in a minute. Let you marinate on that. Any other reactions to the death of Patroklas? What else is this story talking about? What else do we see in the story of the death of Patroklas? We have a very interesting connection between Zeus and the other gods, right? What is this showing about Zeus and the other gods? There's some comments about. You guys are very vocal on the discussion board, but you'd rather listen to me talk, which is very unusual. I'm a little surprised by that.
Well, I guess one point of the story is that gods often act in groups, I guess, because Hector gained a lot of his power from, it was Zeus, and then it was some other god, I forgot his name. But he borrowed their, whatever it was, but he borrowed the power from them and killed Patroklas.
Right, so we have the idea of the gods as a collective and as interconnected with each other in a way that affects what they are able to do, and a lot of people mentioned that they were surprised how Zeus was not able to act on his own volition, given that Zeus is supposed to be the ruler of Olympus and, should have the final say. If he is the king of the gods, he should be able to act according to his own will and his own decisions. But Zeus is, if anything, less free to act than a lot of the other gods, because the way in which the gods have divided themselves over the Trojan War, for one thing, means that Zeus has to remain impartial in order to prevent a calamitous civil war in Olympus. And as I mentioned on the discussion board, Zeus has already seen such a war. He's already seen an all-out destructive war between the gods, the clash of the Titans, which he knows endangers all of the natural world as well as the gods themselves. He's striving to prevent that. So while each of these other gods is acting in partial ways and performing random acts of support. Zeus needs to be most conscious of his connections to the other gods, and the effect of the gods is in terms of how the gods are connected to each other, how their collective responses affect the outcome of human affairs. And the reasons that gods interfere. Why do the gods interfere? Why are the gods invested in this war at all? To sort of answer that, you'd need to read all of the Iliad. But is there anything that we can tell from this particular excerpt about why the gods interfere at all?
Well, I know why the war started. It was because Paris had given Aphrodite the apple.
Right.
That made her the most beautiful goddess. That's probably why.
So this is and this brings up one of the reasons why the gods end up being divided, because that's a story of jealousy between the gods. For those of you who know the story of the golden apple, very quickly is that Hera and Athena and Aphrodite had come across a golden apple that was inscribed "To the fairest," and they decided they couldn't decide which of them was the most beautiful, and so they called upon Paris of Troy to judge. And Aphrodite bribed him by saying that he could have the most beautiful women if he voted for her, and so he gave the apple to Aphrodite, and as a result of this, Aphrodite supplied him with the most beautiful woman, which happened to be the wife of the Greek overlord Menelaus. So the gods act in petty ways that bring about human conflict and conflict between the gods. This is an emphasis of how the gods are not bound by human morality, and their concerns are about their personal needs. Feels weird to say personal in relation to them, but it's about their personal needs and their collective relationship with the collective of humans. So, as a result, we get a system of the gods acting in ways that are counterexamples to human behavior. And part of the indictment of the Greeks in the Iliad and the Odyssey is that the mortals follow suit and are just as capricious and immoral as the gods. So there's a sympathy there. There's a correlation that's being shown. The Greeks in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Bronze Age Greeks, are being shown as being just as petty and selfish as the gods are. All right, let's talk about mystery cults. What is a mystery cult? Yes.
There are different features of it, but one is that it changes your identity if you join a group. It's like a rite of passage. In a way, it changes your identity, and in some cases can secure your place in the afterworld with blessings and stuff like that.
And so this is a cult that is designed to transform you and provide you with benefits in this life and in the afterlife. Yes.
It's like almost like a club centered around like a deity, and they promise initiates like special information or wisdom that would either benefit them now or in the afterlife, and it doesn't like replace religion though. It's ancillary to it.
Right. It doesn't replace religion. It's an augmentation to your local civic religion that allows for you to gain the benefits of membership that come partly from the connections that you make within the cult, but most especially from a special relationship with the god or goddess that is at the center of this cult. And that is the process of transformation. You become, through initiation, somebody who is connected to this God, who has a new relationship with the divine, and a new relationship within a subset of the community. The most visible aspect of a mystery cult, which is implicit in all this, but it hasn't come up, is what? That they're secret, right? That what goes on behind the walls of a mystery cult is not to be divulged to anyone outside of who has not been initiated. So, secrecy, an improved future, relationship with the cult's central god or goddess. It exists alongside civic religion, and it involves a set of special stories, special aspects of the myth. Some of these are part of the culture of the community where the mystery cult develops. Some of them are, and so we know about them. Some of them are stories that are told only behind those walls. And so are most likely to be lost to us. There are a few rare exceptions. The Satyricon has a account of what goes on behind the walls of a particular mystery cult. But as the Satyricon is a sort of a parodic work, we don't know how much of it to take at face value. So this gives us a pretty clear sense of the obvious question: why mystery cults develop? They emerge to a large extent amongst the Greeks. We hear about mystery cults at first in Greek communities and then in the Hellenistic world. Any thoughts on why this would be a Greek phenomenon? Why something like this would develop in Greek lands? What it is about? Does this tie in with Greek culture in any particular way? Yeah.
Well, since they're all city-states, and wouldn't each city-state kind of have its patron deity? So, as Greeks spread out across the world, they might form cults to their deity back home or something like that to continue worshiping them, even though they're no longer home.
That's possible. Yeah.
I guess this one connects with the idea of having aspect being like every single city-state, they have their own aspect, and therefore they would have their own mystery cults as well.
Right, so essentially the god or goddess of a mystery cult is an aspect of the core concept of that god. So, for example, if you look at the Eleusinian cults, the goddess at the heart of that is Persephone. But the role that Persephone is playing is a particular function that is specific to this very local community that does not divulge what happens within it. It's an extreme form of localization, and it's a manifestation of how independent the Greek city-states are, and how the other thing that's characteristic of the Greeks is that there's no priestly class, right? The priests are not telling people how to behave. And so there's more room for the development of a sub-community that worships in a particular way, as long as they can be approved of by the community. They don't have to suffer the oppression of the priestly class who would see mystery cults as a challenge to their authority. There's no priestly class in a Greek city-state. And so there's nobody except the community itself to object to the development of a subgroup with its own cultic practices. And the key to doing this, therefore, is likely to be, how would you prevent the community from objecting? There would be important members of the community, it might be members of this cult, or the cult might perform service for the community, or gain a reputation for the benevolence of their god or goddess being beneficial to the larger community as well as just to themselves. The reputation, the way in which the community thinks about this cult is just as important as what goes on within the walls. So, the Eleusinian mysteries. I talked about this is the story of Persephone, and but there's also another element at the heart of this, which is that according to the traditions of the Eleusinian cult, so you have to appear before Persephone and show that you have become pure and are worthy of a positive afterlife, an underworld feast. And the basis for this is the specific myth that Zeus, after defeating the Titans, used their bodies, burned their bodies and used them to create humanity. And so humanity has intrinsic to us the wickedness of the Titans who had rebelled and gone on rampages of destruction and so forth. And the Eleusinian mysteries, there's a process of expiation, of purging oneself of this original sin, if you will, and of this intrinsic wickedness, and being able to appear before Persephone as pure. Samothrakian mysteries, the Bacchic mysteries are very interesting. I just mentioned the Bacchae a little while ago. One of the things that happens with mystery cults is that they tend to involve bizarre rituals. One of the reasons that things are kept secret is that the rituals that they perform are sometimes very unusual, and they don't want other people to perform them without initiation or to misunderstand what they mean. That's one of the reasons why Christianity was thought to be a mystery cult early on, because Christianity involves eating flesh and blood at communion, at the Eucharist. But the purpose of ecstatic ritual is to free the mind, and this is why Dionysus, the god of wine, is so important to the Greeks, because he brings about the release of the mind from restrictions, and so the ability to think of things that people don't normally think, the ability to come up with new perspectives and original ideas through lateral thinking and irrational thought. You're not constrained by the rigors of morality and reason. You're unleashed. And this is a means of greater understanding, a means of greater contribution to the community. This is why the Bacchic cult was so provocative, was so intrinsically Greek. We have the story of these gold tablets that instruct you on how to pass through the afterlife and present yourself to Persephone again, which sounds very familiar. It's like the book of Ani all over again. It's like the Book of the Dead. It's a list of instructions and prayers for you to follow in the afterlife. So it's not an original, it's not a unique Egyptian idea. The cult of the Great Mother is something that emphasizes the Mother Earth goddess. Mithras is a sun god from Mesopotamia that got adopted by certain groups of Roman soldiers, and it's developed as a sort of Hellenistic Roman mystery cult that is primarily male and is a means of creating a distinctive identity for Roman soldiers away from Rome. Yes.
Have you watched the show Raised by Wolves?
I have not.
In that show, that cult of Mithras becomes like the Christianity of the universe, and the whole world follows that cult.
Is it on Netflix?
It's on HBO.
That's an interesting idea. It's usually what ifs about Roman history tend to emphasize, like there's 9 million science fiction stories about Julius Caesar not dying and ending up being an eternal emperor. So it's interesting to get something more original like that. I'll have to check that out. So as we mentioned, the process of initiation is a process of transformation. And it's not simply reciting words, it is a means of change. So, as you mentioned, it's similar to a rite of passage for adolescents or to induction into a guild or a professional group. You are transformed from a boy into a man, and you have a new relationship with society, a new relationship with the gods. Or you are transformed into a blacksmith, and you have a new relationship with the community, a new relationship with the gods, or at least the god of blacksmithing. So, very similar. How is it different? How is initiation into a mystery cult different from a rite of passage? Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking different from an occupation. Never mind.
Well, no, so you can. You can answer that one too.
Okay. For the occupation one, it would be that it would be specific requirements for someone to be in a mystery cult for an occupation.
Right. Well, and there's a specific requirement for adolescents too. You have to, you can't undergo the rite of passage unless you're a 14-year-old boy. There's a separate one for girls, but yeah.
Guilds like the cults also promise like secret knowledge and stuff, and like ways to make whatever craft.
Right. So it's an altered future. It's a improved future, and like I said, a changed relationship with the community. The difference is that you can only go through these things once. Those are things that can only happen to you at a specific point in your life, and you can only do it once. Whereas a mystery cult is something that is non-exclusive. In fact, in a pagan community, in a pagan culture, it's a positive thing to have improved relationships with multiple gods. The other difference is that in line with what you guys were saying, for a rite of passage, and especially for induction into a guild or profession, you are joining people with similar or identical background to you. And so the resulting community is homogeneous. With a mystery cult, you have people who share an identity because of the cult itself. So it's a transformation of the individual, but it's also a transformation of the people involved. The secrecy we talked about with the nature of secrecy is part of the appeal. The secrecy gives it a cachet, gives it exotic nature, and also protects the nature of the initiation. You don't want the initiation to be practiced by amateurs, if only so that to prevent those amateurs from thinking that they have a beneficial relationship with the gods. The cult itself is sanctioned by its patron deity. And so to be initiated is to be transformed by that process of initiation through the grace of that deity. And so that has to be kept secret in order to prevent people from attempting to perform it and not achieving the results promised by the community. And also to reinforce that sense of identity, which can often be an alternative to an identity within a community. Mystery cults become very important later on in the history of Christianity because they become focal points for rebellion against church authority and heresies. So we'll talk about that in 2 weeks. Etruscans, I'm finally on today's topics. I'm going to talk about Etruscans. I don't think I'll get to writing, but I will talk about the Etruscans. So the nature of the Etruria is that it embodies this territory here that is sort of enclosed by the Apennine Mountains and bounded by the Tiber to the south. So we have this coastal plain here in which the Etruscans settled early in the Iron Age. They're there before the Indo-Europeans arrived from the north. And they've already developed a successful and established city-state culture that is composed of isolated and extremely independent Etruscan communities that are at a considerable distance from each other. You know, this is a vast territory. There's only on the order of 25, 30 major Etruscan city-states. They're spread out over all of Etruria. And they each develop a very distinctive version of the Etruscan culture. They have a strong connection with the Greeks, who are settled in southern Italy and practice a great deal of trade with them. A lot of the Greek vases that have been recovered through archaeology, a fair proportion of them were actually recovered in Etruria because the Etruscans bought them from the Greeks. The Etruscans admired Greek goods and were influenced by Greek culture and mythology. The Etruscans acquired a writing system which was either from trade with the Phoenicians or the Greeks. It's based on the Phoenician writing system, and it seems to be influenced by the Greeks as well. So the Etruscans are already here and have developed this impressive and wealthy city-state culture when the Indo-Europeans arrive, and particularly the Latins who settle south of the Tiber and emulate the Etruscan city-states. So this is just like the Minoans. The Etruscans are the indigenous, wealthy city-state culture with an isolated language not related to anyone else, and with obscure origins that aren't connected. They're essentially autochthonous. They're already there when anyone else arrives. They're the indigenous population, and the Indo-Europeans show up, emulate them, surpass them, and absorb them. Yes.
So is the migration of the Latin people, is that the same migration that also brought the Dorians into Greece? Does that happen like the same time?
It's not the same migration, the same origins. The Dorians and the Italians are different Indo-European tribes. So they both migrate into the Mediterranean world around the beginning of the Iron Age. But the Italians come a couple centuries later from a different part of the Indo-European homeland. But it's the same process. The Indo-Europeans migrate into the Mediterranean world looking for grazing land and encounter the populations that exist there. So we've encountered this with the Hittites, we've encountered this with the Persians, it also happens with the Hindus, and we've seen it with the Mycenaean Greeks and the Dorians, and now with the Italians. The Indo-Europeans come into the Mediterranean world, they encounter an existing, flourishing city-state civilization, they emulate it, surpass it, and absorb it, the resulting culture being a synthesis of both. And so as a result, we have this collection of Etruscan city-states that have very little to do with each other, that have inherited a heritage and share a language and a set of gods, but are fiercely independent and local. The Etruscan culture, and especially the Etruscan religion, is local, even more so than the Greeks. Because there's no unifying influence. It's a tendency of city-state cultures for each city-state to have its own arrangement of the pantheon, its own version of the mythological stories, and its own cultic practices. Each city-state in a city-state culture will have its own arrangement of the pantheon, its own versions of the mythology, and its own rituals. So Uruk in Sumer, for example, will have its own versions of how it understands the gods, will have its own stories about Inanna and the other gods, will have its own cultic practices as part of a city-state culture in which the other city-states will similarly have their own versions. We see this most of all with the city-states in Syria and Canaan, where we talked a great deal about each Phoenician city has its own subset of the pantheon, its own version of who the creator god is, and its own set of rituals. So what tends to happen is that there are unifying influences that work against this, that homogenize the set of culture, partly as a way of distorting our perspective. So, for example, for the Greeks, we have Homer, who provides a generic version of Greek religion in order to tell stories about human failings. We have the Hittites. What happens with the Hittites is the palace. The Hittite rulers create a unified set of a collection of all of the different gods and practices, and attempts to collate and organize them so that the Hittite rulers can govern this vast and diverse territory and all of their different subject peoples effectively, and relate to the gods of individual localities through different means of divination. For Mesopotamia, for Babylon, we have evolutionary monotheism, where the influence of Marduk tends to subsume all of the other mythology of the surrounding territories, so that everything becomes connected to the mythology of Marduk, and the rituals are altered accordingly. In these kinds of communities, we have unifying influences that counter the local nature. For Etruria, there's nothing like that. There's nothing that connects the Etruscan cultures. And so their understanding of the gods, they share a pantheon, but each city-state will have its own version of the pantheon, its own arrangement of which gods are important to them. Will have its own mythologies, will have its own mystic and mythical practices and cultic rituals. The Etruscan culture in general tends to be more open in terms of the relaxed nature in which the families relate to each other, in which the genders relate to each other. Our understanding of them is fairly complacent. They seem to be a culture that enjoys leisure and sort of relaxed behavior. The problem with that is that our understanding of them comes from the Romans. And the Romans create their own identity as a defiance of Etruscan laxity. One of the reasons for that is that our information about the Etruscans is very limited in terms of what they have left behind. There is very little Etruscan literature, partly because their culture was absorbed by the Romans, partly because of other factors, and our ability to understand the Etruscan language and literature is limited by a shortage of specimens. So this is the wrappings of the mummy that you read about. This linen book of rituals and festivals that survived because it was used to wrap a mummy. And this is the Capuan tablet. These two things are the single largest examples of Etruscan literature that we have. So our means of understanding the Etruscans is problematic and filtered through the Romans. And since we'll be talking about the Romans next week, I will finish talking about the Etruscans then. And in the meantime, don't forget your discussion of the reading this week. Bear in mind the way in which the Etruscans think about the gods is being talked about by Romans, and so you can look at that and think about it in what we can understand about how the Etruscans thought about their divinity and the role that religion plays in their society. So make your posts and quiz due on Sunday, and come to me with any questions about the research essay. We'll talk about the exam next time. Have a good week.